My name is Jeff Anderson. I am here with my colleague Molly Burke. And in our middle is what has earlier been known as John Doe 84, who was one of two of the first people to have come forward and brought suit against the Children's Theater as a result of the abuse of him by its founder, John Clark Donahue. At that time, he was John Doe 84. He's chosen to now share more of what he's been through and why, and he'll address you in a moment. We're also here today because two more courageous survivors have filed suit in Hennepin County District Court. John Doe 170 and John Doe 171. Both of them, like formerly Doe 84, who will give his name to you, were violated both by the culture and the adults at the Children's Theater and by the predatory perversions of John Clark Donahue. Both of whom were inspired to take this action because they've begun to come to grips with it because of the courage of Doe 84 and Laura Adams, who filed suit with him some months ago. They have chosen to name the Children's Theater Company for its choices made by them in the 70s and in the 80s, when the adults in charge, who had the opportunity to make the choices to protect the children, chose rather to protect the image and the reputation of the artistic community that had been created by its founder and those that were a part of it. These survivors have chosen to take some of that power back that was taken from them as kids, and now make what the truth that has never been told and or known. Because what was known back in the 70s and the 80s was a half-truth. And all of those kids who were violated by Donahue and other adults in positions of power had their truth suppressed. And they were required to lie or remain silent. And so today, we honor those survivors that have come forward, and particularly honor Todd, formerly known as John Doe 84. And I want you to hear from him as to why he's chosen to take this action today. Todd, step forward.
My name is Todd Hildebrandt, and I'm Doe 84. I'm coming forward today to explain why former child actors and students of the Children's Theater Company are sharing their stories of child abuse. John Clark Donahue, former artistic director of the Children's Theater Company, envisioned a new model of creativity for how to create theater. His idea was to include and involve children in the responsibilities of a play and a school, to teach them the skill sets they needed for these roles. adults would work side by side with children. The children were trained as actors, technicians, dancers, stage crew, all under the guidance of theater employees. This idea is in the name of this theater, the Children's Theater Company, which means a theater company that involves children in the creative process of theater. This new culture of theater had a flaw. It did not give a voice to the children who were being sexually abused by some of the employees. This happened because there was no advocate within the organization for the children to reach out to for help. The victims were trapped. I too am one of the victims. Decades later, survivors, looking back with the wisdom of years, started to realize that this is blatant child abuse. And the symptoms they suffered in life can be attributed to these events. The Children's Theater Company as an organization has never taken full responsibility for their lack of protecting children during this era.
Todd, this is a picture I'm holding up of you when you were violated as a member of this company. It was at the age of 15, and this is a picture of you at the age of 16.
That's correct.
Not long after the abuse of you by John Clark Donahue, its founder, you suffered in silence, correct?
Correct.
Not able to share this with anybody?
No. At the time, John controlled the school, the theater, and the board, and he was my abuser. The board had a winning formula, so they weren't going to tamper with it. I could go to the dean of the school, but she was there pretty much just to protect the school. And I couldn't go to the staff because they didn't want to lose their job. So pretty much the only option I had at the time was just to drop out, and I did.
And Todd, when you brought the first suit along with Laura Adams, and as these two other survivors bring suit today, it names the Children's Theater, as well in this case, John Clark Donahue. He, of course, is not the only offender given cover there in the 70s and 80s. But we named the Children's Theater, and you choose to name the Children's Theater in this suit because you want what to have happen now, that this is being revealed?
Well, I really want the true story to come out, that really they had a huge responsibility for all these children. I'm just one of many. And not just one of many of the theater students who were at the theater at the time, but many other survivors that are out there. And I think that's really important for me in this case, that the Children's Theater, they found that they were lacking. They just didn't protect children. I mean, it wasn't that there was no protection whatsoever. If there was a problem with the employees that you were working with, I mean, John had this idea that was kind of reciprocal. You know what? We were supposed to be providing all this creative energy and imagination as we were participating in these plays, and we were supposed to learn from the staff. So really, I just really want people to know that everything we were doing was under the guidance of the staff. Okay, there was nothing that we were doing within the theater that was just on our own. And the staff had a responsibility for their own behavior. Also, they had a responsibility to the parents and the community to make sure that these kids were safe. And unfortunately, they failed to do that, but just not on a small basis, but on a catastrophic basis.
And so Todd's lawsuit, and that brought by Doe 170 and 171, does name John Clark Donahue as a defendant. But the reality is that he couldn't control his sexual impulses, and he couldn't control himself. But he used his position as founder, as employee, as a position of authority to access Todd and countless other kids, while other staff, adults in charge, chose to both look the other way, and when it became known, chose to suppress the truth, requiring some kids to lie and not listening to others. And so it is a time for reckoning. It is a time for the truth to be known, the full truth, not the half-truth. It is a time for accountability, and the legislature gave survivors like Todd and the others time to come forward and to bring such an action until May 25th. So it's a time for truth. It's a time for transparency. It's a time for accountability. And it's a time for the whole truth and to begin a process of healing and to do what we can to make sure that there is a measure of reckoning and accountability so it doesn't repeat. And it's a time to also acknowledge to you, Todd, for your courage in having come forward as a Doe 84 and speaking today, and to all the other survivors, Laura Adams among them and others, for their courage in sharing their painful sorrows and the unspoken truths, those secrets that could not be shared before. And the reason they couldn't be shared and or known before is because the culture of children's theater in the 70s and the 80s were so devoted to their reputation that they disregarded and ignored the safety and welfare of the kids. And they made the choice. Today, Todd and the other survivors are choosing the side of the light, the truth, and as painful as it is, it's not about what children's theater is today. It's about what children's theater needs to do to reckon for what has been and cannot be allowed to happen again. So to all those survivors that have come forward and are, we express our gratitude to you, Todd, deeply our gratitude. Thank you. Today you're 53 years old?
Right. Yeah.
Any questions?
Todd, to your knowledge, how many other victims might there be more than the four of you?
Well, I can't give you a number. I'll just say this: there are many of us. Many. I can't give you a specific number because I don't have an exact number, but I know there's a lot of people.
Dozens?
I would say more than dozens.
Hundreds?
I can't say that for a fact.
Can you talk about what life is like for you now? What do you do these days?
What do I do? I am employed. I work. I'm married to a wonderful wife, my wife Annette. It's interesting when you say these days. My life actually has been very absorbed about this case. I was here for the December 1st press conference with Laura, and after that, and Jeff warned me, you're going to have some flashbacks. I was like, oh, okay. Well, after that press conference, I had huge flashbacks. I had nightmares. I had post-traumatic stress symptoms. I went through everything. It was as if I was a theater student again. I was 15 again. Since then, I actually feel like I've been 15. And so I've just really done a lot of research for my background on that, just to kind of recall everything that was going on. I feel that what people don't really understand is that for survivors of child abuse, there's a direct link between child abuse and adverse adult health outcomes. And this is one of the things that I've been going through since December 1st, having to manage some of those depression or anxiety about the situation. So that's what I've been doing recently.
And so, Todd, as an adult who abuses a child, is it fair to say and hear that you struggled with this your entire adult life, with depression and anxiety, guilt and shame, but now that you came forward and were a part of having come forward, it's getting better as hard as it is?
Well, I would have to say the December 1st press conference, the feeling that overwhelmed me was vindication. I mean, after all these years and just talking to just a few people about this, less than a handful, I just felt that my story, my experience, and pain at that time was vindicated. It was like, it went through a process. It was found true. It was valid. It meant something. And so that's something that survivors, I think, carry through their whole life. They experience trauma, and that trauma is still within their brains. So it's just a matter of learning how to manage that trauma.
And as to the question of how many victims do we believe there are of John Clark Donahue and other offenders, including Jason McLean, including Adam Zach, including, who else have we got public on?
Those are the three
Okay.
perpetrators.
The actual numbers to date are unknown to us, but what has been revealed, when you look at it in the aggregate, it is a staggering number of kids who are allowed to be abused by adults, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes not in plain sight, but at all times under circumstances where other peer adults were not available to act and chose not to. And so they then were abused in the haze of peer pressure. And then when there were a few kids that did tell and shared the secret, and law enforcement became involved, and the board became involved, and the offenders became alerted, what happened at the Children's Theater? The Children's Theater adults, those in charge, suppressed that truth and convinced with the offenders those kids to lie under oath in the courtrooms, in the grand jury, and in the like. And that is one of the more disturbing and damaging aspects of the culture that was allowed to be created. Not only were these kids being repeatedly violated, but they were then required to suppress their own story and oppressed until now. And so they are free to speak. They are now free to act and free to use the legal system, a way to take their power back and recover some of that truth that was suppressed back then. So there you go.
Jeff, at the time of Donahue's sentencing on the criminal charge, almost 30 years ago, his attorney said that this was totally mishandled and blown out of proportion. How do you
What was
react to something like that?
Donahue was ultimately the only one that was convicted, even though not the only one that was investigated in the 80s. Grand jury was convened, but because the kids were so suppressed, they couldn't tell the full truth and never did. Donahue received and served a jail sentence of 10 months. And it was known and revealed at least that he had abused, by his own admission, 16 kids. That is an underestimate. Multiply it perhaps by 10 when you consider all the kids who he and others like him had access to freely. Because the culture of that day, created by Donahue and the adults around him, was to treat these kids, the kids like this, as adults. And then to give sexual permission to all those around them, and in this powerful, magnetic, artistic, inspiring culture, permission to engage in sex. And so, to the comment made by the lawyer for Donahue or anybody back then, that was then. And that was both a lie and a suppression of the truth and a violation to the human rights of those children, who they put second to the reputation of the Children's Theater Company.
Mr. Hildebrand, what went into your decision-making between December 1st and now to go from Bill 84 to letting up here?
And the question is what made you just go from Doe 84 and December 1st and remain anonymous to come forward and stand before the public and the cameras today?
I wanted to put a face to John Donahue. I just felt that, for the last 2.5 months, there's just been Doe 84. I felt that with the media coverage, the focus, I'm not saying it was wrong, but there was a lot of focus on other abusers. And I feel that I came forward specifically to talk about the responsibility of the Children's Theater Company at that time. So that's what brought me here today.
During the time of abuse, was this common knowledge among the students? I mean, did you talk amongst yourself about what was happening?
It was common knowledge about the students, but believe it or not, this was common knowledge in theater communities from Los Angeles to New York. This was probably, it was all known in the theater community. People like to talk about rumors about John Donahue. There was never one rumor of John Donahue. Only facts that people did not check out. So common knowledge, it was totally, it was a different time. There weren't mandatory reporters then or anything like that. None of this was hidden. None of this was something that was certainly a puzzle that someone had to figure out. But it was all there, all the facts. But the kids, they just had nowhere to turn.
What about the parents? Do they know?
My mother just died last June at age 84. I never told her. There might have been some people who told parents, but you may have supportive parents, but typically what they do is just yank the kid out. You might have parents that would say, how could you let this happen, and not really understand that was not the kid's fault. So, as regards to the parents, I do hold them responsible, but they were also given the story of CTC and the story of the magic that they did. They created an incredible creative and magic space on that stage. And everyone was enthralled by that, I and even the parents. And the parents, kids wanted to do more acting back then. They wanted to be a part of something, and this was something that I just, I felt that I really belonged when I was there. So it was really hard for most of the students to go to their parents about this, because it would have dashed their dreams. It would have, they obviously would be guilty. We just felt so responsible that we basically took care of our parents to manage, possible hurt throughout, our entire lives.
I think it bears mentioning that the parents of the kids on the whole were duped. The parents were misled that this was the best school, the best place, the safest place, and the most artistic community in the nation. And they were all duped into believing it was not only safe, but nurturing. And the reality is it was all those in charge of this culture that were able and in a position to hear this open secret about the kids talking about the sex and the parties and the drugs and the alcohol and all the things that was swirling all the time. Not for months, not for years, but for over a decade that this went on and was ignored and blind eyes were turned time and time again. Secrets shared time and time again. kids talking time and time again, kids telling staff time and time again. It's like they were given permission to be sexualized by the adults, and because of that, the reality is they weren't processing this as abuse. They were processing this as an opportunity to be a part of something big. And that's what they were taught. And that's how sick and twisted this is and was, and how serious we need to realize it was. So we're here today not to demonize what children's theater is today, but to reveal what it was, and for them to reckon and to encourage survivors that have been suffering in silence to know they have until May 25th to take action and take some power back, because this is not about sex. This is about the power that the kids didn't have back then to share this secret and or be able to do more than they did, and the power that the adults had back then to choose to do the right thing and did not. And many of those adults who did know were mandatory reporters because they were teachers, but they chose not to report, not to act, and they chose to protect this iconic reputation at the Children's Theater. Gratitude to Todd today, deep gratitude. Can I give you a hug? Thank you. And to all the survivors who have chosen to speak and come together at this really important time. It is a time for reckoning.
What do you want to see happen to your user at this point? I mean, what would you like to see happen from here?
The question is what do you want to see happen to John Clark Donahue?
You know, I just want him to know. I just want him to know that the damage he caused is a lifelong trauma that people have to live with. So at this point, he knows who I am. He gets the name of, who the people are on that end, and it's just, for me, I just want him to know, hey, you know what? It just was it was something that I don't wish on anyone else in this room to have ever had happen.
And the burden that he had to carry by serving 10 months in jail paled compared to the burden that Todd has carried for over 4 decades and the other survivors have had to carry for over 4 decades, because they were not only violated, but they weren't allowed to speak and have the truth known and or get the help they deserved to get at that time. Thank you all. Thank you, Todd.